The Renaissance is one of my favorite periods of history, and it's in part because, in a lot of ways, it's the Renaissance and maybe the late medieval period that brought us to where we are today. It's in a lot of cases the closest sense of the focus on the individuality, the humanism of us, and in our beginning of our focus on science. The medieval period in Europe was very, very significantly about religion, and the Renaissance was a period of transition. Renaissance, the word Renaissance, means rebirth in French. It began a period of renewed interest and engagement with what we refer to as classical learning and culture, literature, art style, etc. And that's ancient Greek and Roman. Like I said, we've been studying the Middle Ages for a while, so I want to remind you of the context for the beginning of the Renaissance. In the High and Late Middle Ages, we saw increased trade and commercial activity. There was a lot more connection between places that were a lot further away. Remember, early Middle Ages, they were very focused on the village, the manor. You didn't, unless you were particularly well off, you didn't tend to get goods or services from anywhere further away than maybe the next town over. We saw in the High and Late Middle Ages urbanization. After the Black Plague, after the Black Death, people started to move towards living in towns a little bit more. In part, that was because if a serf could leave the manor for a year and a day, he or she, really usually he, was free. And there was a lot more work available in the towns, which meant better wages, which meant better lives for themselves and their children. We saw commercial and business developments, the beginning of banking. We saw a middle class begin to form. Rather than just peasants and nobility, there was this, in a sense, commoner middle class made up of merchants and bankers who had a lot of money, but who didn't have the titles that obviously the nobility did. There's a decline in feudalism, again, in part because of the plague. There was a decline in the church's hold and control on society and government. And again, like that, a lot of this goes back to the Black Death. A lot of this goes back to the plague, because what they learned from that was that priests and so-called good people were getting sick. God wasn't protecting them. So people began to wonder if maybe God didn't have control over everything, or at least if maybe the priests weren't able to connect with God over everything. We saw a growth in vernacular literature. Vernacular just means like of the people. So in the late Middle Ages, we saw, for example, Chaucer begin writing in English, and that was unheard of. And actually, in a large part, the English that we speak now is because of Chaucer. There were a lot of different dialects of English in the mid to late Middle Ages, but Chaucer wrote the Canterbury Tales and a lot of other things in this form of English rather than in Latin, rather than in French, which was the language of the court at the time. And we saw growing literacy. More people could read and write. And there was kind of corresponding to that, there was the rise of universities and the expansion of learning. So all of this was sort of the groundwork for the Renaissance moving forward. So what did change over the Renaissance? Well, before we had a focus on the afterlife. The individual wasn't important. God was important. Society was important, but the individual was not. There wasn't a lot of focus on learning in the arts. They were the so-called Dark Ages and the Age of Faith, or the Church. In Europe, after the Renaissance, or during the Renaissance, there was more of a focus on this life, on the things that were going on right now. The individual began to have more importance as an individual. There was a focus on learning, specifically the classics like the Iliad, which was an epic poem about the Trojan War, or Aristotle, who was a philosopher in ancient Greece, and using the classics to inspire learning in the arts. We call the Middle Ages often the Dark Ages. The Renaissance was a rebirth. It was a return to classical ideals, but it was also a movement forward away from them. And whereas the Middle Ages is often referred to as the age of faith or religion, the Renaissance is usually called the age of reason, or thinking and science. Now, when I talk about the Renaissance, there's actually sort of two divisions. There's the Italian Renaissance, which came first, and then there's the Northern Renaissance for places like England and France and Germany. The Italian Renaissance focused on the city-states of northern Italy and Rome. It intended to be more worldly. It was a greater emphasis on secular or non-religious pursuits, on the humanities and on the arts. There was a lot of wealth and power behind the Italian Renaissance, and the key there was knowledge. The four major trading cities in Italy that, in a sense, sparked the Renaissance were Milan, Florence, Genoa, and Venice. We've talked a little bit about Venice, and you've probably heard, or hopefully remember a little bit about Genoa, who was sort of a counterpoint and enemy to Venice when we were looking at the growth of Venice with the Tides of History podcast. Florence was wealthy from woolen banking. The Medici family, which ruled Florence, were bankers with a fairly significant political power, and they hired artists and architects to make Florence great. Like I said, the city-states of northern Italy, and specifically Florence, were the birthplace and the center of the Renaissance. Italy at the time was politically fragmented. It was separated into a bunch of city-states which often fought for power and control. Some of the major ones, like we said, Florence, Venice, Genoa, and Milan. City-states were ruled usually by wealthy and very powerful business people. Milan was ruled by a duke, but not all of the rulers of the city-states were actually nobility. In a lot of cases, there were oligarchies, which were groups of individuals, powerful individuals, who maintained order, or occasionally it were individual signori, or despots, or people who ruled on their own, often because of their family. The Northern Renaissance, meaning Northern Europe, occurred later. It involved England and Spain and France. The Holy Roman Empire and the Netherlands were key sort of players in the Northern Renaissance. One of the reasons why it was delayed was that area of Europe was really sort of bound up in war for a very long time. There was the 100 Years' War between England and France. There was the War of the Roses in Britain. There was a lot of political unrest happening in Northern Europe at the time, where the Italian city-states were not peaceful precisely, but a little more in control. And in the north, we saw resurgences of the plague, not the Black Death specifically, which was the one in the the major one that we talk about when we talk about the bubonic plague. But the bubonic plague came back multiple times, even as late as the 1600s in England. So plague and famine and war meant that the Renaissance started in Northern Europe a little bit later. Major themes of the Renaissance were humanism, secularism, and individualism. And these are all things that we see in modern day. And this is, in a sense, where they began. Humanism recognized human potential. It validated the idea that the individual was the individual human, that humans themselves were worth something, that we weren't just here to suffer for sins and then die and either go to heaven or hell, as the Christian religion would suggest, and many of the other religions at the time had similar ideas about humans. So humanism validated human potential, progress, and the idea that we could learn more, that we could build on our knowledge. Secularism, like I said, secular means non-religious, so this was a greater emphasis on non-religious values and concerns. And then individualism was the focus on the unique qualities and abilities of the individual person. Keep in mind that in the Middle Ages, like I said, it wasn't really so much what the individual could do, it was what the larger group, it was what was good for the larger group, for the society, for the for God, what God wanted, not so much what the individual wanted or could do or was capable of. It's important to note humanism was, like I said, one of the key ideas of the Renaissance, but it wasn't a new idea. Socrates and Plato, both, remember Plato, we read the allegory of the cave as part of our poetry unit. Socrates and Plato were both classical Greek philosophers, and humanism was based on their ideas of learning through observation and reasoning, being able to make sense of the world in that way. Humanism made man, rather than God, as the center of the universe, as the, in a sense, is the most important thing. Humanism sees man as in control of his or her own destiny, as being able to learn about and understand the world by observation and reason, rather than through the words of God, which was the only way to understand the world according to most medieval Christians. Humanism focused on secular learning. We saw the development of early modern schools and universities. Oxford and Cambridge which are very well-known and prestigious schools in England, were formed during this period of time, during the Renaissance. And humanism, in part because of this idea that humans can learn about, we can learn about and understand our world by observation and reason rather than solely through the words of God, it led a lot of people to question governments and the institutional church, which was very closely interwoven with the governments. So some of the major events of the Renaissance period, there was the Age of Exploration, which was a period of European expansion that had much better outcomes for Europeans in a lot of cases than for the people who lived in the places, the indigenous people of the places where they expanded. We saw the Protestant Reformation and the religious wars. The Protestant Reformation was a reworking of the church. If you remember back when we were talking about the Middle Ages, Christianity in the beginning was just Christianity, and then it split into the Eastern Orthodox Christianity and the Western, which was the Roman Catholic Church. And then here it starts to split into more versions of Christianity. When you think of Christianity now, there are many, many different, I don't know, in a sense, varieties of Christianity. This was the time of the scientific the scientific revolution and the rise of modern science, and it was the rise of the modern nation state, which is largely how we organize our world now. Some of the major innovations of the Renaissance: printing press. Some of you looked at this when you were looking at the Middle Ages, although it is properly speaking part of the Renaissance. This was in 1455. It involved movable type printing, so they could move the letters and words around. And it was developed in Germany by Gutenberg. In 1456, the first Gutenberg Bible was printed. And the major impact of the printing press was that knowledge and ideas and learning could spread more widely and more quickly, because rather than having a person who had to write out everything, you had now the ability to make multiple copies of books almost, well, not instantaneously, but at the same time. These are some images of what the printing press, the original printing presses, sort of looked like. So you can see, I don't know if you can see my arrow, so I'll just draw this here. You can see him choosing and setting different letters into the words, and then this would go into here, and the paper would go underneath it, and then it would be pressed down by those people. Another invention was the clock. In the Middle Ages, time was marked by candles. A candle mark was roughly meant to be an hour, but the precision that we have today, where we can know what time it is down to the millisecond, that idea of quantification, the idea that we can understand the universe in terms that can be measured, like a centimeter or a second, that was unknown in the Middle Ages. In the Renaissance, because of this focus on observing and on reason, people started to need more precise measurements. And so things like the clock were invented, and that changed the focus of daily life, which had been guided up until now by the rhythms of the church. There would be bells that rung at certain points during the day that would mark off time for the people in that village, whereas now people could mark time themselves. These are not precisely exact images, but these are clocks from the Middle Ages that have lasted with some repair throughout, from then to now. Not Middle Ages, sorry, Renaissance. The focus of the Northern Renaissance was a little more religious. In the Italian Renaissance, there was a large focus on secularism. In the Northern Renaissance, religion was still very important, and the Protestant Reformation that we talked about, that was in the Northern Renaissance in Germany, to be precise. We saw a lot of religious reform, changing how things were going. A lot of people, at least a lot of the people who were involved in reform, believed that the church was becoming too focused on worldly things, on secular things, on power and money, and they wanted to return the church to what they saw as its true mission, and spirituality. They were highly critical of this worldliness and the corruption that they saw in the church and the papacy, which would be the rulership of the Pope. They saw education and literacy as key to social and religious reform, therefore, and because of that, therefore, there were the same focus on learning that we saw in the Italian Renaissance. And they advocated the translation of the scriptures, which is the Christian holy writings, into vernacular languages, so into the languages of the people, English, German, French, rather than keeping it all in Latin, because Latin meant that you were dependent, most people were dependent on a priest who could interpret them for them. Most people didn't speak Latin unless they were of the nobility or a priest. Whereas they did understand, or at least were more likely to understand, the vernacular language of their country or of their region. So by translating the Bible into a language that people could read, people could start to interpret the words of God for themselves, rather than depending on the church to interpret those words for them. Some of the major people, texts, and ideas, you can look these up if you're interested. Sir Thomas More wrote Utopia, Utopia being this idea of a perfect world in 1516. Martin Luther was a priest who wrote the 95 Theses in 1517, and that sparked the Protestant Reformation. Castiglione, an Italian, wrote the Courtier in 1528, which more or less discussed what, good behavior looked like. And I'll talk a little bit about these in a moment. Niccolo Machiavelli, you may have heard the term Machiavelli or Machiavellian. He was Italian as well. He wrote The Prince in 1539, and it was basically a treatise on how to be in power. And then William Shakespeare, who almost everybody's heard of, has written far too many texts to list, but a lot of his plays and a lot of his poetry and a lot of the language that he created has sort of trickled down into the modern era. The Act of Supremacy was what Henry VIII wanted to establish him as the supreme head of the English Church instead of the Pope. He had married someone who wasn't giving him children, and he wanted to be able to divorce her. The Pope told him he couldn't, so he got upset and decided that he wanted to be the head of the church instead of the Pope. He became the head of the church, which is the Church of England or the Anglican Church, and was able to divorce his wife and marry somebody else, which is what he'd wanted in the first place. Utopia asked the question, is it even possible for a perfect world to exist? So what it does is it imagines this complex, self-contained community. It's set on an island with a common culture and a way of life. And he goes about, okay, so with no other influences, is it possible to have this perfect world? The word utopia comes from the Greek utopas, which means no place, and which is similar to eutopas, which is a good place. Please forgive my pronunciation. I don't speak Greek. Martin Luther, like I said, was associated with the Protestant Reformation. He was critical of the church's corruption and abuses, and he sought reform with the 95 Theses. He actually wrote the first translation of the Bible into German as a vernacular language. The 95 Theses in 1517, it was a response to Pope Leo X's round of indulgences to help build St. Peter's basilica. So basically, in Catholic mythology, you sin, and a sin is basically a crime against God, and if you sin, then you don't get to go to heaven. So you can do prayers and penitence for your sin, to say that you're sorry and to try and make up for it in a sense. Or you can, the Catholic Church began to sell what were called indulgences, and indulgences basically forgave you of your sins. So if you did something sinful, if you had the money anyway, you could purchase an indulgence and that sin would be washed away. And in this particular case, Pope Leo X was trying to build St. Peter's Basilica, and so he sold indulgences to people who had sinned. And Martin Luther didn't see that as being valid, as being what God wanted. So again, because of the printing press, within 2 months, copies of the 95 Theses, which he hammered to the door of the chapel of the University of Wittenberg, the copies spread throughout Europe. He was ordered to take it back. He refused, and he was excommunicated, which means in Christian mythology that he was more or less banished from the church. He couldn't get married. He couldn't, if he died, he would be buried in unsacred ground. He would not be able to go to heaven. He was basically outcast. And the reason why he wrote the translation of the Bible into German was because he believed that the church didn't have the authority to interpret scripture, that each person needed to figure out what God was saying themselves through thought and through reflection and through prayer. Castiglione wrote The Courtier, which was written in Italian. It was basically a instruction manual for young men on how to live up to the ideal of a Renaissance gentleman. It stressed the value of education and manners, and it had a huge influence on social mores and norms during the period, on how people in society acted and should act and were expected to act. Niccolo Machiavelli was a public servant in Florence, and then he was the ambassador to France. He was well educated in the classics. He favored republican rule over despotism, and republican rule in essence was not quite democracy, but definitely rule by a larger group of people who had a variety of different interests and knowledge, rather than a single person who had power over everybody else. He was tortured and imprisoned when the Medicis regained control over Florence, because the Medicis were despots and were not really keen on this idea of sharing power. So his experience, both in Florence and in France, led him to write The Prince. The Prince was written in Italian. It was observations and commentary on political rule and power, and looked at how to effectively rule, how to gain and maintain order and control. It was not about being a good ruler in the sense of morality. It was about being a good ruler in the sense of practicality. The ends justify the means. He was very focused on secular and humanistic ideas. And his basic ideas were that a good ruler, an effective, practical ruler, had quick and decisive decision making, was good when possible, but was also evil when necessary. He challenged the idea that God has this idea of social order that we all fit into. And he believed that politics should be governed by its own laws, not by the same laws as other people. A couple of his quotes, and you may actually recognize some of these. Machiavelli is the one who said that it's safer for a ruler to be feared rather than loved. And he said, and this is a little, disheartening, one can make this generalization about men. They are ungrateful, fickle, liars, and deceivers. They shun danger and are greedy for profit. And I don't know that I agree with him. In fact, I'm pretty sure I don't. But keep in mind the people that he was basing this on fit into that generalization more often than not. William Shakespeare, who I absolutely love, is an incredible writer, prolific writer. He wrote a lot. He was a poet. He wrote 154 sonnets, some of them to a man, some of them to a woman. All of his sonnets were romantic. He wrote 5 long narrative poems, and he's probably better known as a playwright. He wrote more than 37 plays from 1588 to 1613. He was a member of the Lord Chamberlain's Players, which was renamed to the King's Men after James I took the throne. And the Lord Chamberlain's Players, or the King's Men, owned the Globe Theatre. Ben Jonson, who was writing about Shakespeare, said that he was not of an age, but for all time. And if you read his plays and understand his plays, because the language is definitely different than the language that we speak now, although it can be interpreted. A lot of the themes that he writes about, family and love and honor, these are all things that exist throughout time. Not just in the time that he was writing. And I think that's one of the reasons why his plays have lasted so long. And, they're amazing in their original forms, but they've been interpreted into modern forms as well. Things like 10 Things I Hate About You, the movies 10 Things I Hate About You, or She's the Man. There are a lot of different Shakespearean plays that have been modernized and turned into fairly successful movies. Shakespeare wrote tragedies, comedies, histories, and romances, although not so many of that last. And keep in mind that, histories, that's fairly self-explanatory. He wrote Roman histories like Julius Caesar, Antony and Cleopatra, of ancient Roman times. He wrote histories of medieval kings, King Henry the Fourth, parts 1 and 2, King Richard the Third, and other ones. These are not the only plays. The difference basically between tragedies and comedies is that tragedies end with a lot of death, and comedies don't. Both tragedies and comedies, all of his plays include humor in them. And most of them include at least moments of sorrow or trouble, difficulty. Some of his most famous tragedies, Romeo and Juliet, Hamlet, Macbeth, King Lear, Othello. Some of his most famous comedies, Much Ado About Nothing, Midsummer Night's Dream, Taming of the Shrew, Merchant of Venice. Our school, under normal circumstances, goes to Bard on the Beach every year. And the Bard on the Beach, Shakespeare is known as the Bard. Bard on the Beach does Shakespearean plays. If you have the opportunity, I highly, highly recommend it. Shakespeare's works, at least his plays, were never meant to be read. They were meant to be performed, or they were meant to be seen. And there is the things that people find difficult in terms of understanding them. A lot of that goes away when you see it with the actions and the interpretations that the actors put on those words. Renaissance art was a reflection of Renaissance ideals and values. There was the emphasis on the classical style and classical themes. It was humanistic with an emphasis on the individual. Religious art still remained very important, however. The difference between medieval versus Renaissance art. Medieval art was usually focused on telling the story for political or religious reasons. So they weren't really concerned with realism. Medieval art often has sort of a cartoon-like quality. Images aren't really realistic. Buildings and objects are not usually in perspective. Things are often not the proper size and shape. And the images and scenes in medieval art often feel sort of flat and two-dimensional. Human faces aren't individualized. People look stiff with little sense of movement. Children often don't look realistic. They sort of look like smaller adults. Renaissance art, on the other hand, reflects humanism, so it tends to be more realistic. They have better sense of perspective. The scenes and the people are more 3D, three-dimensional. It celebrates humanity, the human body, natural form. So when you look at art side by side between medieval and Renaissance, you can often see the difference. So characteristics of Renaissance art: realism, three-dimensional. It's very balanced and ordered. There were a lot of portraits. There were a lot of landscapes and attentions to images of nature. And they often drew or painted in a classical style with a depiction of classical themes and stories. So this is the School of Athens by Raphael. And you have, it's hard to show on here, but there are actually figures from, including Raphael, figures from history that are drawn in here. You can see the sense of perspective. The arc in the back is smaller, the arc in the front is larger. The people look in proportion to where they are on the page and to the larger scene. Individualism, we saw a lot of portraits and people looked unique. They focused on their qualities, their personalities. Both of these are by Leonardo da Vinci. You've got the portrait of Ginevra de' Benci and the Mona Lisa, which is probably one of the most famous Renaissance portraits of all time. They focused on secularism, so non-religious stories and scenes, whereas most medieval art tended to focus on biblical stories and themes. This is Botticelli's La Primavera. Religion did remain a major focal point of Renaissance art. It's not that religious art simply went away and they only focused on the secular. But even with that, and this is part of the Sistine Chapel, which was painted by Michelangelo, and keep in mind, like, this is the kind of roof of the Sistine Chapel, so he had to be leaning back and painting up all of the time. You still see bodies that look realistic. You still see this focus on perspective and on proportion. Some of the famous Italian Renaissance artists: Michelangelo. He was born in 1475 in a small town near Florence, considered to be one of the most inspired men who ever lived. This is his statue David, done in 1504. And you can see the realism of like his hair and his eyes, the expression. It's very realistically done. La Pieta, 1499. This is a sculpture in marble. Moses, 1515. And this is the Sistine Chapel, or pieces of the Sistine Chapel. These are 4 closer up scenes of pieces on the Sistine Chapel, all of which were scenes in the Bible. The creation of Adam, the creation of Eve, the separation of light and darkness, the Last Judgment. Leonardo da Vinci is the definition of a Renaissance man. He was a genius. He lived from 1452 to 1519. He was an inventor, an engineer, an architect, a painter, a sculptor. He was amazing. So he has some famous paintings like the Mona Lisa, the Last Supper. His notebooks, though, he did a lot of studies of animals, of body parts, of how things work together. I mean, you can see, like, he did in-depth studies. So we're talking like sinews and muscles as well. He invented various weapons and various, I don't know, engineering marvels, things that would never have been thought of. His notebooks are extensive, and he seemed to sketch pretty much everything. Raphael was born in 1483, lived to 1520. He was the one who painted the School of Athens, which we saw a little bit earlier. And remember I said there were different people in there? You have Pythagoras, as in the Pythagorean theorem, drawn in there. You've got Socrates giving lectures of sorts. He actually more taught through questions. You've got Plato and Aristotle, again, 2 major philosophers of the ancient Greek times. Euclid, which is a mathematician, a very well-known mathematician. You've got Raphael painted himself there in the back. See, there he is. And you've got Zoroaster and Ptolemy, who were scientists. He painted the Sistine Madonna. And then in the Northern Renaissance, there were artists like Jan van Eyck. One of the really cool things about this painting, so, you know, as again, it's very realistic, the proportions are right, but if you look in, hang on, if you look in here, that is the mirror that's back here. You can actually see, so here's the guy, and here's the woman, and you can see right there the painter, Jan van Eyck himself. This is a portrait of Giovanni Arnolfini and his wife in 1434. Albrecht Durer was a German painter, printmaker, and theorist. He did some really high quality woodcut prints and engravings, and he was in communication with Raphael and Da Vinci. He was born in Nuremberg, and he established his reputation and his influence across Europe when he was still in his 20s, which was pretty young. It's also unique that he was in communication with some of the major Italian artists of his time. From 1512 on, he was actually the sort of official artist of Emperor Maximilian I. This is his self-portrait. These are some of his engravings. You've got the four horsemen of the apocalypse and Saint Michael fighting the dragon, the night, death, and the devil, melancholy, one of his actual paintings, Trento, View from the North. So the Renaissance brought a new way of thinking and living to Europe. It was a completely new worldview. The medieval Christian worldview was giving way to what we would consider more modern, secular and humanistic view of the world and humanity. It wasn't perfect. Very little of our history is, and there were a lot of things that they valued, but only when it came to Europeans, or specifically Christian Europeans for the most part. But there was a lot of value in what they did as well. And it was a significant step towards our modern world.